common that I hear when folks come into my quilt shop, String and Story on Main, is something along the lines of, I keep telling myself I'm gonna shop my stash before I come here, but I just never know how to do that. I just get really overwhelmed. So here I am, getting all the fabric for my quilt. All right, today I would like to give you some pointers for shopping your stash before you go to the quilt shop. My name is HollyAnne Knight of String and Story, and it is my job to guide you to quilt with confidence. And I love spending time talking about free motion quilting and about how you can use the fabric that you already have, which is a little ironic when you consider the fact that I do in fact have a whole quilt shop. But if you're gonna come see me, I want us to make a plan together, and I want you to feel really excited about your purchases and your quilts. So let's talk about how you can shop your stash before you come shop with me. All right, today we're gonna talk about 3 ways that we can go through this. The first I call the whole enchilada. That's where we're gonna pick absolutely everything for a quilt from start to finish out of our stash. The second I call mix and match. So we're gonna shop some of the things from our stash, and then we're gonna go to the quilt shop and pick out some coordinating things and put them together to make a quilt. And then the third thing is just thinking about shopping your stash for those finishing details, maybe like your back or your binding. All right, let's jump right in. First up, let's talk about how to shop your stash for an entire project start to finish. There are 2 immediate ways that come to mind for doing this. The first is that if you have a fabric line that all works well together and you can use just a single line of fabric for a pattern, then you can just work with that. So this Dogwood Blossoms quilt behind me is actually an example of this. This is Monarch Grove by Fableism, and Dogwood Blossoms is a fat quarter friendly quilt. So I grabbed myself a handy dandy stack of fat quarters, sorted them into pairs for the flower and the background of each block, cut it out, and put this quilt together, all right? So if you've got a stack like this sitting in your stash that you'd really like to use, a pattern like Dogwood Blossoms is an easy and quick way that you can make a quilt start to finish from just a single fat quarter bundle that's in your stash. Now, the second way, and this is gonna be maybe a little bit more common, is going to be making something a little scrappier, like this Star Island quilt that I have in front of me. Now, spoiler, these fabrics that are sitting in front of me are not the exact fabrics that are in the quilt, but this is representative of the process I used when I pieced this quilt, all right? So the first thing that we're gonna wanna do if we go, I think I would like to make a project, and I'd like to make it entirely from my stash, the first thing we're gonna wanna do is we're gonna wanna make some rules. Right? Otherwise, you're gonna throw open the cupboard doors and go, I have a lot of fabric and I'm really not sure where to start. All right? And there are 2 rules that I recommend making right away. The first rule is I recommend picking out a pattern. Now, you can come see me at the quilt shop to do this. You could get online and find a pattern, or you could look in your stash for a pattern that you already have. And I would decide how big of a quilt we're interested in making. So if we open up the Star Island pattern here, let's say that we want to make a large throw. It's going to be about 65 inches square, or 3 by 3 blocks. Then I know that I'm going to need 5 colors, and I know how much yardage of each of those colors I'm going to need, right? So by creating this first rule, we start to narrow down how many colors do I need and how much of each color do I need. The second thing I want you to do is I want you to actually build a color palette, right? Now, I have these handy dandy color chips that I made from a Paintbrush Studio color card. And I pulled a few representatives of each color that I wanna work with and put them all in a row here. So my colors are going to be navy, white or cream, yellow, orange, and turquoise. And you can see that reflected in the fabric that's already in front of me. And now, if you don't have colored chips, you can use colored pencils, you could use paints, you could just write down what colors you want, or you could pick a scrap from your stash to represent each color, all right? There's lots of ways you could do this, but set some parameters for yourself of what colors do I wanna work with. So now I know that I need 5 colors, and these are my colors. This makes it a lot easier to go to my stash. So if you're gonna go shop your stash and you've got these colors, I want you to go to your stash and I want you to pull out all the fabric of each of these colors. Now, if you have a really, really large stash, and that's an enormous amount of fabric, maybe pull a representative sample. But the idea is that we want to try to pull out more than we're ultimately going to need. Because from there, you can start grouping things together like, well, I think these navy prints look good together. I think these yellow prints look good together. I think these teal prints look good together, right? And reference your pattern, and I recommend picking out, if you're gonna be making a scrappy quilt, 1/4 to 1/2 yard extra fabric. So for example, on this, For one of these star points for the yellow, it says I only need 3/4 of a yard, right? So I'm gonna make sure that I have 1 to 1.25 yards pulled in order to make this quilt. Because let's assume that I'm using fat quarters and I've got 3 fat quarters. I may not be able to get all of my pieces cut out because scrappy cutting tends to be a little bit less efficient. So always plan in to have a little bit of extra fabric. Go through, separate your piles, measure your fabric, and get approximately the right amount of fabric in each pile. Then set those all in a row and go, all right, I like how all these look together, right? So we'll start lining these up like this and go, okay, I think these are all gonna look nice together. I think these are gonna be the ones. And then I might look at this and I go, you know what? This one's actually really green. How much fabric do I need for that? And I need 2 3/4 yards. So let's say we're gonna need 3 yards to be safe. I would unfold these pieces, make sure I still have 3 yards and go, that's a little green. I think it's gonna look funky in the quilt. I'm gonna set that aside, right? So go through that process, kind of isolate your fabrics that you're gonna use for the quilt. Make sure you like how they all talk to each other. Then set this stack aside. And with what's left on your table, go ahead and pick out your backing and your binding for this project. And voila, you have pieced the whole enchilada from your stash. Congratulations on successfully shopping your stash for this project, all right? The next method that I wanna talk to you about, like I said, I call this mix and match. And this is the method that I'm in the process of using for this lovely Polaris quilt. So this is also a star-based quilt. Both of these patterns that I'm using as examples, by the way, Star Island and Polaris, are very scrap friendly. So if you are also wanting to scrap bust, you could pull colors from your scrap bins as well and do some of your cutting from there, okay? So this mix and match method starts out shopping your stash, and then you're going to pick a thing to go shopping for, all right? So we're gonna start out making the same exact rules. We wanna pick a pattern, and we wanna pick some colors. Now, in this particular instance, I was using leftover scraps and fat quarters from a couple of fat quarter bundles. We had busted into a Monarch Grove fat quarter bundle and a Camp Gingham fat quarter bundle to make a couple of other shop samples, including this Dogwood Blossoms quilt behind me, right? And we had leftovers. I went, you know, we just generated a lot of extra fabric. I wanna make sure that that doesn't go to waste. So rather than picking colors, I picked fabric lines and pulled those, all right? But as you can see, this is gonna be really scrappy. There's gonna be a lot going on. So looking at this Polaris quilt pattern, I said, you know what? I want the stars. These star points this way and these star points this way to be made from this fabric that I already have, right? I wanna make these pretty. I want them to be really scrappy, kind of bold and unexpected. And so I paired up those fabrics in order to make the stars. But because there's a lot going on, right? We've got big ginghams, we've got small ginghams, we've got these Monarch Grove wovens. I was like, this quilt runs the risk of looking really chaotic. And I wanna just settle it down a little bit. So then I went to my cornerstones. I said, you know, some of these are really dark. I think having some nice light cornerstones will just brighten it up and create some good contrast. And I happen to have an extra cut of fabric, again, left over from something else. I pulled it from my stash of this white sprout woven. And that left me with just one section of the quilt, and that was the background. And again, I'm thinking through, this is already gonna be really scrappy. I'm worried it's gonna get chaotic. The thing that I'm gonna mix and match, the thing I'm gonna shop for on this quilt is gonna be my background. I want a consistent background on this quilt. And so then I got yardage of this lovely green background so that as I start to put these quilt blocks together, they're not gonna look too chaotic next to one another, right? That green is gonna calm the whole thing down and make it visually really lovely to look at, all right? Things like backgrounds, sashings, cornerstones, borders, those are excellent candidates for being your kind of calm, I'm gonna go to the store and buy a coordinating, unifying thing, all right? And so as you go through choosing that pattern, choosing your colors, and then starting to pull from your stash, then take all of that with you to the quilt shop and play the matching game to pick out the piece that you want to add. Now, you might be adding something from the shop because you just got an itch to buy something new. You may not have a good fit for that section of your quilt. You may just want an excuse to support your local quilt shop. Those are all really good ideas. Just make sure you bring your pattern and the fabric you pulled from your stash to the quilt shop with you, and at least here at String and Story, helping you pick out that final piece to match fabric you already have is one of our very favorite things to do. In fact, it's why we have a lot of things like the Paintbrush Studio Solids and like these everyday chambrays. They're gonna match a lot of different fabrics because we wanna help you do that. The final way I want you to think about shopping your stash today is when you have a project that you're finishing up, right? Maybe you bought all new fabric for the quilt top and it's time to baste that quilt and get it done. If you've got fabric in your stash that you're like, I want to use this fabric, it's time for it to get used, I really want to shop and work with what I have rather than heading to the store, backings and bindings are also really good candidates to just incorporate a piece of something you already have into a quilt you're making. The biggest thing when it comes to stash busting and using your stash is remembering that stash busting is not about using your stash down to zero. Stash busting is about creating flow in and through your sewing room so that you have the joy of picking out new projects and picking out new fabrics and bringing them home with you, but also the joy of finishing them up and moving them out of the sewing room again. And if you can build a habit of sometimes shopping entire projects from your stash, sometimes mixing and matching things, and sometimes just grabbing a backing from the fabric you already have, you'll keep that flow moving and keep that creative challenge and creative energy high. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you've enjoyed this, please head down to the link in the caption of this video. I have a fabulous little freebie for you called the Quilting Rockstar Set List. It's gonna help you focus on just 3 projects, 1 to piece, 1 to quilt, and 1 to bind. So you have a little bit of focus as you're moving those things through your sewing room. And of course, everything that I've outlined here for you today is also written in a blog post so that you can peruse it at your leisure. Again, I'm HollyAnne, Knight of String and Story. It's my job to guide you to quilt with confidence. Thank you so much for joining me today.